to grab a snack, do so as we're getting set up here. I'll go ahead and share my screen so we can look at stuff together. And I'm gonna make that small. And Alex, are you recording, or should I?
Yep, we're already recording.
Oh, great. Excellent. All right. So today we're focusing on the digestive system. If you've been following us, we've been doing different systems every month, and we've already done the respiratory system. And I'm excited about the digestive system because I feel like it's one that a lot of folks have questions about. Obviously, it's a really complicated system and one that we tend to see a lot of dis-ease or dysfunction with. So we'll try to talk about the different parts of it and give you a better understanding for where the digestive system kind of like rests when it comes to our whole body. And then we'll talk about some herbs that can be useful for different kinds of digestive upsets. So this is an overview, right, of the digestive system here, right, from the esophagus down to the anus. But there's plenty of things that are left out of this diagram, actually, and as we move along, I want us to kind of think back to this one and all of the things, the different systems or different body parts that might be missing from this. As we study anatomy and physiology together, or by yourself, we usually will kind of split things up into different systems, right? But we know, especially as herbalists, that all of the pieces work together and all of the systems work together. So I'm always trying to kind of bring back in the different systems that might be missing from the actual picture, but are definitely part of this system as well, have influences on the system. So I wanted to start by talking about the flavor bitter, because most of the herbs that we're going to talk about later are bitter herbs. Bitter can be both a noun, an adjective, an emotion, and an action. So bitter as a noun is, as an herbalist, we might talk about a bitter, and that's usually in the form of a tincture, which is an extraction of herbs into alcohol. So we might say that we're taking a bitter, or if anybody's a cocktail fan out there, you might put bitters into your cocktails. So that's using it as a noun, right? Bitter as an adjective is more like how we might be used to talking about it as a flavor, like, oof, that was really bitter. And then thinking about bitter as an emotion, and kind of like when you talk about someone being bitter, how that kind of plays in. I'm always really interested in how our languages will take these different parts of the body or systems of the body and infuse that into other ways, that we speak and use language. And so bitter also is kind of this emotion, right, of like, oh, that person is, they're kind of bitter, about something that I said, or they're bitter about losing or whatever it is. And then the last is an action. And that, again, is speaking to herbalism, where we're talking about bitter and its actions on the body. And usually that's in the form of digestive action. And so we'll talk about that a bit more as we go. I'm curious to know how everybody out there engages with bitter in your everyday life. You're welcome to unmute yourself or drop a message in the chat if you'd like to tell us about ways that you engage with bitter flavor in your everyday life. I can't see the chat, so if anybody's chatting, Alex, and you don't mind reading it out.
Amy just says coffee.
Yeah, absolutely. Anybody that's a coffee drinker probably is experiencing bitter, right? Unless you put a lot of sweetener in it. Anyone else?
Dean says dandelion root.
Oh, nice. Like dandelion root, like as a replacement maybe for coffee. A lot of folks like to use it as a replacement for coffee.
That's all I'm seeing.
Okay.
Oh, here comes one. Bitters in soda water and tinctures from Digestive Health, ginger, mugwort, and blue vervain.
Oh, nice. Oh, blue vervain is super bitter, yeah, but so lovely.
Yeah, mugwort
Nice,
too.
nice. So yeah, here's some different ways that we might engage with bitter on a daily basis, right? Like some folks might have those dandelion greens or other bitter greens on a regular basis. You've got the bitter melon down there, chocolate, turmeric. Definitely, bitter is not a popular flavor in this country, anyways. There certainly are folks that engage with bitter, but I'd say as a culture, foodscape nationwide, it's kind of hard to find bitter when you go out to eat. So you have to kind of seek it out for yourself, right? Or be intentional about incorporating it into your diet. So what are the 5 tastes? We have sweet, salty, sour, bitter, and umami. And I want to talk a little bit about like why we might have taste receptors and like how that plays into our digestion. And so sweet, when we taste something sweet, um, oftentimes that's a signal to the body, right, that this is high energy and calorie dense and usually nutritive food. So we'll see a lot in herbalism that the sweet herb, something like oat straw, is considered a nutritive herb, or something like burdock that has all these polysaccharides and has all of these different sugars in it, is a food that's really building to the body. And so this is a signal that's sent to the body that calories equals energy, and calories also equal the ability to build the tissues that we need in the body. The next is salty, and that makes me think of herbs like nettles in particular, that actually have those mineral salts in them. And the body is attuned to taste salt, right, and to taste that sodium, because we know, we know through the body that we need salt to regulate things like our blood pressure. Our muscles don't work as well without the correct salt balance, nerve function, electrolytes, and water balance. Right? Anybody who's done a lot of physical exercise outside and has sweated a lot knows that they need to replace that salt, and your body will start to crave it. I know when I've been in the garden all day, I'll crave salty potato chips, or crave a little bit of salt in my tea. Sour is another taste that we can taste on our tongue, and that comes from hydrogen ions, and usually those are really acidic foods, and possibly even fermented foods. There's some thought about why we developed the ability to taste sour, and there's some thought that maybe there was the need evolutionarily for us to be able to distinguish, oh, this is a fermented thing, this thing has started to ferment, and therefore might not be as good for me anymore, or might be better for me. That part is unclear when it comes to why we developed the sour taste bud, but it's directly linked to these hydrogen ions. Bitter is a flavor that we taste because of things like alkaloids and saponins and sesquiterpenes, and bitter has usually a pretty strong reaction on the taste bud, right? And the thought is that maybe that has something to do with potential toxins. A lot of our really deadly toxic plants are very bitter. And so having the ability to taste bitter allows us to potentially save ourselves from those toxins. But I would also posit that so many of our health allies in the herbal world are also bitters, and so many of the foods that we might engage with, things like coffee and chocolate and endives, are also bitter. And so I think, I wonder if the body's more, more able to parse those out than we have been able to ascertain through studies. The last one is umami, which is the signals to the body that that is a substance that is rich in proteins. And so that, of course, is helpful for building tissues in the body as well. I just wanted to put this slide up just to show that a lot of folks will have seen maps like this probably. And while it's been kind of proven outdated and untrue that we only have taste receptors in these different parts of the tongue, and that we can only taste sweet on the front of our tongue, that is not actually true. But we do have clusters of taste receptors in different parts of the mouth that can be more or less attuned to different things, but each of those clusters of taste receptors has the ability to taste all the different flavors. And we're not going to go into it today, but I did want to make sure everybody knew that Tongue diagnosis is something that's been used in, and is still used in many herbal traditions. So here you have the Chinese tongue diagnosis. Western herbalism will use pulse and tongue, and then Ayurveda also uses tongue diagnosis. So if you're really interested in that, I would suggest getting more into it, because it's a lot about what the tongue can tell us about your health. All right, so let's kind of dig into the tongue a little bit. So here we have a taste pore, and the taste pore actually sits in the tongue, in between these protrusions in the tongue. So you can see here that that pore is made up of a couple different kinds of cells. You have the taste hairs up top, and then the sensory cells are also called gustatory cells, right? So the gustatory comes from that word to eat, right? And then you have the basal cells there that are going to replace those sensory cells every couple of days, actually, or a week or so, I think. So we know that probably to be true, right? Is when you burn your tongue, after a couple of days, it starts to feel better, and usually within a week, especially if it's a bad burn, you're feeling much better after that, and you're able to taste again. But when you burn that tongue initially, it ruins your meals for the next couple of meals because you can't taste anything anymore. And then you'll notice that this taste pore is connected at the base to these nerve fibers. And we're going to talk about where those nerve fibers go and how that influences the rest of the digestive system. So here's the tongue on the left, right? And the papillae that are there are these, the parts of the tongue that you can see, the bumps on the tongue that you can see. And so in between those, there are these different types of taste buds, right? So you have those fungiform, the foliate, and the circumvallate are the different kinds of taste buds that are found on different parts of the tongue. There's about 2,000 to 4,000 taste buds in your mouth, or in your kind of like mouth cavity. Each of those has a bundle of 10 to 50 taste receptors. And most of these are located on the tongue, but we also find them in the esophagus, in the nasal cavity, and interestingly, infants actually have them on their mucous membranes of their lips and their cheeks, which makes me think about whenever I've seen babies try new food, that sometimes they'll, you put it to their lips and they'll immediately start to like push their tongue out and be like, ugh, no. And I've always wondered, before finding this out, that, how do they even know they didn't even taste it yet? It didn't even go in their mouth. But infants actually have more taste receptors on their lips and cheeks than fully formed adults do. Taste is rapidly adapted to, and what I mean by that is that those nerve fibers that are at the base there, as soon as a taste molecule actually comes into, whether it's that hydrogen ion or that protein actually hits that taste pore, it's going to send a signal through the nerve fibers. And just like sensation, we know this about sensation, right? If you are touching your skin, when you first touch your skin, you have a lot of sensitivity and you might feel it very acutely. But over time, as you're continuing to touch your skin, you might feel it less. And the taste bud is no different. That's why if you've ever done like coffee tastings or wine tastings, you'll have water to kind of cleanse your palate in between. It's because when you keep tasting that same thing, you no longer have as strong of a response from the taste bud and the taste nerves. And so there's also kind of, makes me think also about how the first few bites of a meal I really will savor, and then, how sometimes you can get really bored of a meal after a little bit if there's not some variety in there. And that also has to do with, the kind of those taste buds getting tired and stopping to fire quite as frequently or as strongly.
Looks like we have a question back to when you were speaking on infants and their receptors in their cheeks.
Great.
Is that more on the outside cheeks, or more adults have on the inside of their cheeks?
On the inside of the cheeks, yeah. On the inside of the cheeks. All right, sorry, I went backwards. So these taste receptors are the bitter taste receptors, which are referred to as T2R taste receptors. And this one happens to be a lingual taste bud, right, which means on the tongue. But like I said, we have them in the esophagus and nasal cavity as well. And what we're learning about bitter taste receptors in particular actually is that we have bitter taste receptors all over the body. They've discovered bitter taste receptors in the lungs and in the heart. They've discovered bitter taste receptors down into our intestines. And we're not actually sure what all of those bitter taste receptors do yet, because they're not connected to our brain the exact same way that our taste buds on our tongue are. Right? When we taste something on our tongue, it sends that message and we actually have a sensation or understanding of what that taste is. But when we encounter it lower into the system or in a different part of the system, we don't have that same message sent to the brain, but there are actions that happen after that taste receptor is, receives something. And so that's something that we're still actually, through science, learning a whole lot more about. And I had a study that I was reading about with the respiratory system in particular, which I thought was interesting because a few months ago we did the respiratory system together. And if y'all were in that class at all, you remember that we talked about ciliary beat frequency, which is like the little hairs that are on the cells that help to move mucus up and out of the lungs. There are several taste receptors in the lungs that respond to specific bitters. And when those bitters are tasted through those receptors, it increases the ciliary beat frequency, meaning that it can, the cells can move more mucus out of the lungs, which we know, for health reasons is we don't want, overloads of mucus in the lungs that, creates pneumonia and all kinds of problems. So that's like a whole new side of medicine that's really being understood now, is that we have the ability to communicate with plants through our body in ways that are still pretty mysterious. So when it comes to digestion, we know that bitters, when they interact with these T2R receptors, and when I say bitters, I mean either a tincture or a bitter taste like coffee. So anytime you taste something bitter on your tongue, there's a chain reaction that's set off. And here's some of the things that it does. It produces saliva. So you might have more saliva coming into the mouth when there's a bitter taste. The thought around that evolutionarily was that this was a way to dilute something bitter potentially, right? Maybe we had something toxic come into our body, and so the response is to immediately fill with saliva so that we can spit it out or dilute it. We're going to kickstart the stomach, gallbladder, pancreas, and liver. There's pepsin that's produced and started, and bile is primed. The muscles of the sphincters are toned, and we'll talk about the sphincters at the top and the bottom of the stomach and kind of all the digestive issues that can come out of not having good muscle tone there. And then there's these glucogen-like peptides and gastrin and all these other chemicals that are released into the blood when we taste bitter that prime our body for nutrients coming in. And then there's a signaling of satiation and a feeling of fullness that can prevent overconsumption. So there's been a good amount of study kind of linking the consumption of bitters to lower prevalences of overeating or potential obesity. And then for some folks in particular, they feel like having bitters in their diet really decreases their sugar craving. It's kind of like the opposite, right? Like when you have a sugar craving, you feed it some bitter and it helps to decrease that need for sugar. All right, so we've talked about taste receptors, and you can see the picture there at the bottom. Bottom left is that same food chemical going into the taste pore, but actually taste is about 80% smell. So this diagram I think is really helpful in having us see that, right, is that up to 80% of that taste that we're experiencing is actually coming through the nose and up to that olfactory bulb, where the nerve endings are able to interact with it the same way that our taste buds are. And they're going to go to different parts of the brain and send signals and kind of cascades that'll go back down into the rest of the body. So maybe you've heard of the second brain. I think this is becoming kind of a more accepted term and more popular. Is the second brain is our digestive system, but the nervous system on the digestive side. So we have like the brain here at the top and the spinal cord, and all along that spinal cord we have these nerves that run and connect to different parts of our digestive system. And this system is called the enteric nervous system, which is specific to the digestive system. And then we have the vagus nerve there, which is something we're going to talk about in just a second. But that's, kind of thinking about how the, the brain is the place that we think of as kind of calling all the shots. But actually there's quite a lot of information that goes from the stomach upwards. And we are finding, and have known probably culturally for a long time that our ability to digest, our ability to intake nutrients really affects our mood, and it affects our mental stability, it affects our ability to focus. And so there's information going up and down. It's not just from the brain down. All right, so the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve is the longest of the cranial nerves, and it controls your inner nerve center, or the parasympathetic nervous system. And it oversees a vast range of critical functions, things that we really need, and it communicates motor and sensory impulses to all of the other organs of the body. So I kind of like to think of it as, I don't know, as a subway or a metro. Like it's the lines that kind of get all the information to all the different parts of the body and kind of connect things, and it has a pretty important job and can be pretty, sorry, I'm losing my thought here. It can be really influenced by so many things in our life that we might not think about. So let's talk about the nervous system real quick. And this is what I was talking about when I said like that original picture that we looked at is only part of the system, right? Like the nervous system actually plays into digestion really heavily, and we're finding that more and more. And so the autonomic nervous system is what a lot of folks think of as fight or flight and rest and digest. So we have the sympathetic here on the left, fight or flight, and this is the side of our nervous system that prepares the body, organs and tissues and mental state for action, especially action that could be life-saving. And then the parasympathetic side is our rest and digest. So this is really where the vagus nerve kind of does most of its work, and it helps us to regulate mood, our immune response, our digestion, our heart rate, and it sends messages to the brain about the state of all the organs. And then the other one that I put on here is that second brain is the enteric nervous system. And this is a nervous system, part of the nervous system that is autonomous, but it also communicates and is influenced by the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system. So the enteric nervous system, its job is to control the movement of muscles and the secretion in the gut, and then also to release different chemicals and signaling substances. So it monitors and helps digestion happen, especially in the stomach and intestines. And just to kind of look at like what's happening in the body when we're either in parasympathetic or sympathetic, nervous system. And let me back up just for a second. So the sympathetic nervous system, is the fight or flight, and that is our like evolutionary ability to jump into action when we need to save our lives, or to to capture that that animal that we're trying to hunt, or whatever it is. But it's our ability to be quick and have fast action. The parasympathetic nervous system is our ability to be slower and mindful, and also to widen our focus. And we can fall into these in the modern world, right? We can fall into these easily, or it might be a lot of practice and work for us to fall into parasympathetic nervous system. A lot of us find that we live a lot of our life in the sympathetic system because we're so kind of bombarded with information and images, and there's studies about blue light and kind of how that affects our brain. So I just want to kind of keep that in mind, is that there's plenty of folks that feel like it's very hard for them to get into this relaxed state. But what it looks like in the body is that when we're relaxed, we have decreased heart rate and decreased blood pressure. When we are stressed, we have increased heart rate and increased blood pressure. When we are in the sympathetic, when we're stressed, the bronchioles will actually dilate. And that's so that we can get more oxygen into our system, right? Because we might have to run. And then when we're in parasympathetic or more not stressed, we will have the bronchial tubes constrict, or just be more more relaxed, but not dilated. The muscles relax when we're in parasympathetic, or they contract when we're about to burst into action. The pupils will constrict when we're in parasympathetic, and when we're in sympathetic, they will dilate. And so that's also something to think about, is like our eyes can actually change as we're in stress mode or not. And it can make it very difficult to focus on cooking or eating when we're in stress mode and our pupils might be dilated. And so we have, from an evolutionary standpoint, the pupils are dilated so that we can see more, or we have more ability to look at movement on our peripheral, but it makes it harder for us to focus potentially in the center or what we're working on. Stomach movements and secretions will increase when we are relaxed. They will decrease or stop altogether when we are stressed. So Tammy Sweet, who's my anatomy and physiology teacher, says that it's better to not even eat if you're stressed, because sometimes if you're too stressed, you might not even get enough movement or secretions to be able to digest that food at all. Your saliva will increase when you're relaxed. It decreases when you are stressed. You've got adrenaline release, of course, and then there's more urine increase when we are relaxed than when we are in our stress mode. All right, so let's go back to this picture again, and I want you to imagine eating something delicious. And I'll give you some prompts just in case nothing comes to mind immediately. These are some of my favorites. When I think about delicious food, I'm thinking about Hetty McKinnon's cookbooks and these amazing soupy stews and salads, and just seeing all those greens and those colors and textures. Or I'm thinking about maybe Sarah Owen's books with all of her sourdough and her jam, and that's a turmeric and leek bread there that's on the left. And this is what we would refer to as the cephalic phase of eating. So before we ever touch anything to our mouth, there's a phase of digestion that happens just from sight, smell, or even the thought of food. Did anyone, while you were thinking about something super delicious, experience any salivation or change in your body?
I totally did. And I kind of switched the delicious things, and I felt like, I don't know, I even in my mouth kind of experienced different sensations. Like the first thing I thought of was chocolate, and it just didn't feel like there was any tartness in my mouth. And then you flip to the image, and I just saw the red, and it made me think of like pasta with tomato sauce. And I felt like I was actually tasting sour in my mouth. Like it went to that higher pitch kind of experience in my mouth.
That's cool. Thanks, Natalie. Anyone else? Yeah, so even thinking about eating something bitter will often bring salivation to your mouth. So I've thought about, like, even if I'm traveling and maybe I don't have something bitter with me, just spending a few minutes before eating, thinking about eating something bitter, my mouth usually starts to salivate pretty quickly. And saliva is actually a pretty important part of digestion. So yeah, we have this whole part of digestion that we probably don't usually think about, is the sight, smell, and thought of food. And that sends messages to our brain that then again connects with the vagus nerve and that parasympathetic activation, and we'll start getting gastric motility and gastric juices happening potentially pretty rapidly, especially if we are already a little bit hungry. That's when we might start to get those tummy rumblings of the belly getting ready. So we have a bunch of different glands that produce saliva in our mouth, and saliva has some different roles that it plays. So there's 6 major glands, and we have hundreds of smaller ones, and we make maybe 2 to 4 pints a day of saliva. Most of it is actually said to be in the late afternoon, and the least of it is at night. So that makes me think about, like, when I lived in France for a little while, we would have like our big meal in the middle of the day a lot of times, and then kind of take a break and then have a smaller meal in the evening, or just kind of like a wine and chit chat in the evening. So the roles of saliva are to keep your mouth moist and comfortable and also alkaline. Inflammation happens if you have too dry of a mouth, and you also will start to get some tooth and gum issues from having too dry of a mouth. Maybe you've gone to the dentist before and they're kind of picking off that calcification and grit that builds up between your teeth. And at least my dentist will kind of admonish me for breathing with my mouth open when I'm out in the garden, because that drying of the mouth will lead to all kinds of other organisms and bacteria kind of taking over and starting to change the environment of the mouth. Saliva also helps us to chew, taste, and swallow, and it sweeps food away. So, helping us to actually be able to swallow well. It fights germs in your mouth and prevents bad breath. Saliva, when it's healthy, should be full of immunoglobulin A, which is helpful in, promoting our immune system at this stage, right? When things are coming into the body, that's when we really want to be on, high alert to make sure it's not getting deeper into the body. There are proteins and minerals in saliva that strengthen the tooth enamel and prevent tooth decay and gum disease. And then there's also amylase in our saliva, and this is where carbohydrates start to break down. So we'll see later in the stomach that we don't actually have amylase in the stomach, and so the ability to start breaking down carbohydrates in particular happens in the mouth, and then again later in the intestines, but it's not happening as much in the stomach. And so this is where I wanted us to have a little snack. So if anybody has a little snack and wants to, I would say take a bite of something and chew it the amount that you normally would, and then swallow it. And then tell us if, when you swallowed that bite, was your bite liquid? Like, did you chew it until it was pretty liquidy or not? Anybody feel brave enough to tell us what your chewing experience was like?
Joseph said, definitely still a pasty solid form, not liquid. I chewed an animal cracker.
Nice.
And Natalie said that still kind of dry, pasty is a good word.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, when I do this practice myself, I find that when I usually eat at home or on the go, wherever I am, like I don't usually chew to the point that what I've chewed is now, fully incorporated with saliva and is liquid, and I'm swallowing liquid. I have a bad habit from years in the restaurant industry of, I've gotten better over the years of not being in the industry, but I still have, this tendency sometimes to do, a couple chew, swallow. And, if I didn't chew enough, then I'll, swig down a little bit of water to make sure that it doesn't get stuck on the way down. Does that sound, does anybody else identify with that? I do it a lot less than I used to, but the point of having this little snack is to think about, the speed at which we chew and swallow, because like I said, this is the place where we start to break down carbohydrates, and this is also the place where we have tools in our mouth, right, our teeth, that are meant to be breaking down and grinding the food that we're eating so that when it gets into the stomach later, it's not difficult for the stomach to move that liquid around and acidify it, and then it can go further into the system. When we don't chew enough, we often know, right, if anybody's ever not chewed enough of a tortilla chip and felt it scrape all the way down their throat, then you know exactly what that feels like. And there's not really a whole lot that the system can do super well to get rid of, to break that into smaller pieces, which is why you might see, undigested food later in the stool. So just a PSA for everybody to start chewing more. This is a really good place to start, actually, if you're having digestive issues, is just start with how much am I chewing my food, and am I gulping, water to try to make up for the fact that I'm not really chewing, and therefore I might be swallowing a bunch of water. A bunch of air. The other thing I wanted you to see here on this slide is that, so we have the tongue, which is actually a really big organ there, right? And then, or big tissue. And then it goes, the food will go down the back of the tongue there. And then this really tiny, little sliver behind the esophagus is where the food goes, right? So it's like not a very big area. It's not meant to like hold these really big things. So also thinking about just taking smaller bites. And I just wanted to show this cool little image of like how it moves through the system. And there's different words for food as it moves through our system. Once you chew it, it becomes bolus. That's what it's called, bolus. And so the bolus here is being swallowed. And you can see that as the person here is swallowing it, that the body is actually really well designed to close off the esophagus so that we can't breathe in that food, and also to close the nasal passage. That's the second picture that I'm looking at here. Close the nasal passage, and the soft palate actually moves back to touch the back of the throat so that food can't be coming back out the other way. So I just thought that was kind of cool. The body is so cool. This is not related necessarily to where the food goes, but I wanted to point it out now because we're talking about this part of the body. These are the vocal cords that are above the esophagus. And when we hiccup, it's these vocal cords that are snapping back together quickly. That's what creates that hiccup. And it's the diaphragm and the phonetic nerves have been agitated, and the diaphragm pulls up quickly and the vocal cords close quickly. And that's what causes the actual action of a hiccup, which a lot of folks will experience when they're eating, especially if they're having carbonation or they've eaten something, that's too dry.
We have a couple of questions.
Great.
You mentioned that you mentioned carbs, but what about vegetables? Do you have enzymes for that too in the mouth?
That's a good question. So there are carbohydrates within vegetables, and there are proteins within vegetables. So really, like, everything gets broken down in different places in the body. One of the things that's interesting about vegetables in particular, plants in particular, is that a lot of the plants have the actual enzymes in them to break themselves down. And so one of the things that's happening when we're chewing and we chew long enough is that we're releasing those enzymes from the plant tissues. We're actually like breaking those cell walls and releasing those enzymes so that the plant actually helps us to break it down in our mouth. I hope that answers your question.
And is it true that it's best to refrain from drinking beverages as much as possible while eating?
I don't know if that's true or not, as far as like I haven't read any specific studies about it, but as I've been thinking about digestion and learning about digestion, that kind of makes sense to me, that I kind of practice personally to like make sure that I'm hydrating a bit before, like maybe while I'm cooking, I'm trying to drink. And then while I'm actually eating, trying to slow down and let my saliva do the coating rather than washing. And then making sure that I'm hydrating again afterwards, and also incorporating foods into my diet that are water rich. Lots of plant foods, lots of foods like, this time of year, certainly I would be thinking about things like cucumber that are already high in water. So yeah, I think that's probably a personal choice, but I know that a lot of folks practice that, and it seems reasonable to me that would be a good practice.
Christine wants to add that water dilutes your stomach acid.
That's right. That is a good point. Yeah. So another tick in the category of like maybe don't drink water while you're eating. Make sure that you're hydrated before or around your meals rather than during your meal.
I wanted to weigh in really quick.
Please.
The chewing thing is something that I've done research for and knew about amylase and really wanted to change my habit of it. And so I wanted to share my personal experience with trying to develop that habit. Counting doesn't work for me. And being mindful does help, but when I'm hungrier, it's even when I'm aware of it, it's harder. But keeping the idea of mixing the saliva in rather than chewing my food is a better thing for me to realize, okay, I've done what I'm trying to do, which is, you know, get those enzymes or the enzyme into the food. So when I feel like my food is wet, then I'm good. Kind of hard for me because when I was younger, I always hated mushy foods, but it's you know, it's a process. And I don't drink often liquids with my meals. And I've done research about that. In Chinese medicine, they say no liquids. In Ayurvedic medicine, they say hot tea. So periodically I will do hot tea, and I've found that to be helpful, but definitely not too much in my own personal experience.
Thanks, Natalie. Yeah. All right, so we're heading down into the stomach now. So we're down, going down the esophagus and into the stomach. And here's the first sphincter that we talked about earlier with the fact that bitters will help to tone the sphincters. So this is the sphincter at the top of the stomach, and there's another one at the bottom of the stomach. And I want you to see in that scope view that the tissue on the inside here is, right, it's mucous membrane. And so it's very wet tissue. It's very sensitive tissue in a lot of ways. The stomach is unique in that it has a really thick extra layer of mucus because we're going to be creating a really acidic environment for the rest of the food to break down. And so we need to make sure that the actual, you know, tissues here that are pretty, you know, sensitive and gentle aren't going to be affected by that. So so yeah, the body will produce like a nice thick layer of mucus when it's, you know, in a state of health. All right, so we're down into the stomach now. The stomach is broken up into a couple of different parts here. We have the cardia that's up at the top. And if you've ever experienced heartburn and wondered, like, why do they call it heartburn? You know, it's because that feeling, it's a referred pain into, you know, the part of your chest that would hold your heart, that holds your heart. And so this part of the stomach is also called the cardia because it sits close to the heart and is where that association often comes from. If there's pain in this part of the stomach, it often feels like it's pain in your heart. And then you have the pylorus there down at the bottom. I like this picture because it shows these different layers of muscles that are there, right? And also the rugae that are in there that are, you know, that folding, that kind of brain looking, you know, quality of the inside of the stomach. And all of these like little folds and ridges are there for helping us to both slosh things around in there so that we can kind of like physically like move things and push things, but also so that we can have, you know, a little bit of absorption in there. Most of the absorption is going to happen actually lower in our digestive system, but there is some absorption that's happening here actually. Things like alcohol, non-steroidals, like ibuprofen or Advil, water, vitamins, and electrolytes all get absorbed in the stomach in this part of the digestive system. Most of our nutrients, though, are going to be absorbed later in the system. All right. And, you know, so kind of traveling back to that first taste that we had, or even maybe the cephalic phase where we're seeing or smelling something, the vagal nerve is going to send those messages down to the stomach and tell the stomach, like, okay, it's time to start producing, you know, hydrochloric acid, which is what we're seeing in this picture. And I like this picture actually because it identifies histamine here as one of the catalysts, for the release of hydrochloric acid. And I think that, you know, we think of histamine usually as a negative thing in the body, right? Like histamine is where we get itchiness. Histamine is where we get allergic reactions, or when we get a bug bite, it feels uncomfortable because of histamine. So we often put antihistamines on things. But histamine is actually also, you know, implicated in many other parts of the body as well. And this is one of the ways in which it is. I just wanted to bring that up so that we can devilify histamine. So that, you know, hydrochloric acid is, you know, is pumped into the stomach, and that creates an acidic environment. It lowers the pH to about 2, which is very acidic. And that is for multiple purposes, one of which is to kill bacteria, right? So there's plenty of things that come in on our food that we don't want in our bloodstream. And so this is an opportunity to, you know, neutralize that. And then the hydrochloric acid will actually turn the pepsinogen into pepsin, which is how we break apart a lot of the nutrients in our food, especially the protein structures that later will be absorbed into the small intestines. And so this is the place, like the stomach is the place where we're really breaking down fats and proteins. This, the gastric pit is kind of what we're thinking about when we see all those folds, right? And so there's different cells that are involved in those folds. So we've got the mucus cells that are secreting all that mucus. We've got a couple of different kinds of mucus cells, right? Because we're trying to create a big barrier of mucus. And then we've got the cells that produce the hydrochloric acid and also intrinsic factor. Intrinsic factor is necessary for the body to be able to absorb vitamin B12. And that's very essential for our nervous system to function well and for our blood cell production. There we've also got the chief cell that secretes that pepsinogen and the gastric lipase. So the pepsinogen, right, turns into the pepsin, which is how we digest our proteins, and then the gastric lipase helps us with lipids, our fats. And then the bottom one there is the G cell, which secretes the hormone gastrin. Gastrin is a hormone that stimulates the secretion of the gastric juices, and it's secreted into the bloodstream by the stomach wall in response to the presence of food. Right. There are also some other hormones that are at play here, one of which is ghrelin. Ghrelin is secreted by the stomach as well, and it's what's been dubbed kind of the hunger hormone because it stimulates appetite and the increased food intake. And it actually promotes the body to produce fat and to kind of make those stores of energy. So this was from Weight Watchers, right? The hunger hormone is kind of, again, kind of vilified in this, where it's like ghrelin signals the brain to eat. It empties the stomach. Empty stomach causes ghrelin levels to rise. And then, we start to, build these fat cells. And so it's talked about in kind of a negative way. But actually there is a lot of benefit to the body releasing ghrelin. T2R receptors can lead to ghrelin release, which stimulates appetite, like we said, but it also has the ability to slow the emptying of the stomach. And so in doing that, the things that are in the stomach will stay in there a bit longer, get broken down a little bit better. But it also creates a feeling of being satiated, right? So sometimes if food is moving too quickly through the system, or we're just in a kind of a habit of eating more than we need to, having something like the bitter taste receptors that are stimulated at the beginning of the meal can help to potentially release some ghrelin that then gives us that ability to maybe slow down that system just a little bit so that we are less likely to overeat. Ghrelin is also a febrifuge, which means that it helps us to fever, right? So oftentimes when we're fevering, if we have an illness and we're fevering, we're often usually not eating as well, right? Or we're eating small amounts, or maybe we can only take in liquids depending on what kind of fever we have. The body doesn't usually want to eat when we're fevering. And so ghrelin is a hormone that's released when we're hungry that actually helps us to fever better and to fever more efficiently. It also signals autophagy. Autophagy is the ability of the cells to eat themselves, but this is kind of, we can think of this as the cleanup process. Cells are dying and expiring all the time, but if we don't have adequate autophagy, there might not be enough, cleanup fast enough. So there can be cells that kind of are perishing and expiring and then kind of clogging up the system because we don't have efficient ways of moving them out of the system or recycling them, really. And then ghrelin also signals anti-inflammation. And so if anybody has done any thoughts or studies or experiments with intermittent fasting, there's a good amount of research out there as well about how intermittent fasting can help with inflammatory diseases and inflammatory symptoms. And ghrelin is one of the hormones that's potentially responsible for that. So again, we're going to devilify ghrelin. Histamine has good things, ghrelin has good things. All right, so food goes into the system. When it comes down into the stomach, the bolus, it's going to turn into what is called chyme. And that's when it's really in this liquid state, and the chyme is going to be squirted just like 2 tablespoons at a time out from the pylorus into the lower intestines there, back, down basically into the start of the intestines. So it's going to stay in your stomach for a while and kind of like squirt out just a little bit at a time. Most food stays in the stomach about 2 to 4 hours. Yeah, and if we don't have good tone in the lower esophageal sphincter or the upper esophageal sphincter, that's when we can start to see issues with, the lower esophageal sphincter can be letting things go down into the intestines before it's ready. And the upper esophageal sphincter, that's where we get gastric reflux, GERD, and that kind of like heartburn that we're experiencing, because literally some of that acidified liquid is coming back up, and shooting up into our esophagus, and that esophagus doesn't have the mucous membranes and that thick layer of mucus to protect us. So here's a few common digestive illnesses. There's GERD, the gastroesophageal reflux, stomach ulcers, H. pylori infections, small intestinal bacterial overgrowths, irritable bowel, Crohn's disease, ulcerative colitis, and then food allergies, sensitivities, and intolerances are pretty common digestive illnesses that folks will encounter. And each of them is different. Each of them has a lot of the same symptoms. And so it is important certainly to pay close attention to where you're feeling symptoms, how often you're feeling symptoms, like what things trigger symptoms, because when you go to your doctor, they're going to have a whole list of, possible things that it could be. And they're just kind of, maybe just kind of tick through the list because a lot of them have the same symptoms. So the more in tune we can be with our body about when we're experiencing them, how we're experiencing them, and even knowing some of the anatomical pieces in the body to be able to say like, no, I feel it mostly in this particular area. That is helpful for us as well to be able to get a better diagnosis, because as you can see here, between Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis, they might present in similar ways, but are still very different. All right, so we have the cephalic phase that includes that vagus nerve really triggering all the secretions. The parasympathetic system is excited and the pepsin and acid is being produced. The gastric phase, which we really just kind of went through, is that the local nervous system is secreting and there's all kinds of reflexes. The gastrin and histamine stimulation is happening, and we've churned and kind of moved the chyme around, and now we're squirting it down into the small intestines for the intestinal phase, where there is still a lot to happen. At this point, I think it's good for us to also maybe bring up the human microbiome. So the microbiome, I think the recent numbers or current numbers are, we have 10 bacterial cells to every 1 human cell in the body, and we have over 3 pounds of bacteria in our intestines, which weighs as much as our liver. So it's safe to say that we are outnumbered when it comes to the microbiome, right? That there are so many different kinds of organisms that live within us and on us that we'll never be rid of them, and we probably don't want to be rid of them. I know we don't want to be rid of them, but there's still so much that's unknown about the microbiome. So when we think about things like taking a probiotic pill, what we're getting in that probiotic pill is really just the species that we've learned about enough that we think that they are the beneficial ones. But scientists are learning all the time that there are a lot more of them out there than we know about, and we don't know how they all work. We don't know how they work together. So when we're taking a probiotic pill, we're getting just a tiny sliver of what's out there, basically, or what's already within us. And so there is definitely folks that feel, all different kinds of ways about it. Some folks feel that it's not a good practice to take probiotic pills because it's very selective. Other folks feel like we should be getting, probiotic stimulation through fermented foods. And I think there was even one doctor I read about that said, like, it could be dangerous to take probiotics. Honestly, it's still just so new of a, it's just still so new. There's still so much we don't know. That's kind of my 2 cents on it. But some of the things we do know about the microbes and the microbiome is that they are helpful in protecting the epithelial cells of the gut, and we'll talk about those in just a minute with leaky gut. They help us to synthesize a lot of vitamins, especially the ones in the lower colon are really helpful with a lot of the B vitamins. They break down food for us. They stimulate the immune system. They can have direct interactions on our immune system. And then they can help us to fend off pathogenic microbes. We have, this community of microbes in our stomach, in our intestines rather, that are really helpful in preventing pathogenic or opportunistic overtaking. And so this is where a lot of folks will talk about the gut-brain axis, right? So this is kind of going back again to that, like that idea of the second brain, that we have our actual physical brain, but we also have this whole community of microbes and this very complex system of nerves that are working together, or at least communicating together in our gut and through our digestive system, that send messages and also send cytokines and different forms of communication back to the brain. I wanted to talk about leaky gut syndrome for a little bit, because I know that there are probably some folks that are interested in that, or feel like that is something that maybe they've experienced. Let me just grab my note on this. Here we go. All right, so within the digestive system, the intestines, the cells will replace themselves every 3 to 6 days, and they produce, when they are healthy cells, they will produce what's called the normal tight junction or tight junction. And you can see that here, the one on the left, these three that have the tight junction together, like those are bonded and have great tight junction. Things that might lead us to not have tight junctions, one in particular is insufficient amounts of vitamin D. Vitamin D hormonally signals to our cells to create tight junctions and to hold those tight junctions. So from, for where we are in Maryland, from about October to March, at least maybe April, we should probably be taking, folks should be taking vitamin D supplements in some form. I like to try to do that through mushrooms if I can. If you take fresh mushrooms, especially like shiitakes, and lay them with the gill side up in the sun, they can absorb, I can't even remember how much they can absorb, but they can absorb an incredible amount of vitamin D into their bodies. And then you dry those shiitakes and you can use those throughout the winter. I also do take a supplement for it because I don't eat those shiitakes every day. There's the microbiome is also has the ability to turn on and off the genes that signal tight functioning. So that's also something that's kind of being discovered or like being studied, is kind of like which players in the microbiome have that ability, and what are their triggers, basically, what triggers them to do that turning on and off. But when we have this leaky barrier, things can get into the bloodstream and into the tissues that shouldn't be able to pass through. Proteins that are too large, or particles that are not broken down to their smallest, their smallest factors. And therefore, once they get into the bloodstream, the immune system is now going to start to contend with them because they're not supposed to be there, and they will know that. And if we have a chronically leaky gut, this is where so many folks will deal with things like food sensitivities and food intolerances. And from the perspective of like physiology, there's not a whole lot of difference between sensitivity, intolerance, and allergy. Like the body is going to mount the same attack regardless, and that's going to be like producing antibodies, having this inflammatory response, and producing, things like histamine. This is also where we're going to see the production of diarrhea, right? Diarrhea is when the body is going to dump a bunch of salts and water into the intestines and try to flush out, the rest of that food or whatever it is that's in the system. They're trying to dilute itself, right? And when that happens, we have what we see here on the right is malabsorption and nutrient deficiency. If we constantly have this inflammatory response or this diarrhea response, often both, then we're not able to actually absorb things. And when we have inflammation, there tends to be, things get puffy, things get, tighter, things get hot, things might get more mucousy. And so, now we're not able to absorb through the cell walls like we should be, but things are able to get through to that blood barrier. Does anybody have any questions about that or anything they want to add?
We have a question from Joseph. Let's see, Lacey, random question, but could this lead to narrowing of the ileum?
I don't know. That's a good question. Sorry, I can't answer that. Look at it from
Christine
this.
asks, do you think digestive enzymes can help you with leaky gut?
Maybe, but that doesn't come to mind as like the way to start working on it, I guess. What comes to mind for me is that we want to build kind of the body's ability to form those tight junctions again. And we also want to start healing the tissues that are inflamed. So that's where I would be thinking about mucilaginous herbs, in this case, probably things like marshmallow that are really soothing to the tissues. The enzymes, that you can take with food are helpful in breaking food down, and that might prevent, that could prevent some inflammation from happening if like what's getting through into the bloodstream is more broken down. But what sometimes is happening also is that if it's not completely broken down yet, by the time that it gets to this place that has chronic inflammation, then the immune system is still going to recognize it for what it is, if that makes sense.
And is there a difference in digestive enzymes?
What do you mean by that?
It was a follow-up question. Perhaps is there a difference between digestive enzymes?
Like what's on the market, you mean? Or
let's see if she will respond.
There's a difference between enzymes in the sense that like the enzymes are specific to different foods, if that's what you mean. Right? Like the enzymes for protein cannot break down carbohydrates, for example.
I guess I meant in the context of leaky gut, like if there would be a difference in terms of the digestive enzymes that are out there on the market, like what would be more beneficial than not?
Than not taking any enzymes?
Well, like if you wanted to take digestive enzymes, then I know that there's a whole variety of enzymes out there, and I just wondered whether there were any that would be particularly beneficial to further breaking down things so that they don't end up with creating large particles that can seep through the gut.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know enough about what's on the market, and I really haven't looked into like what kind of enzymes you can add to your diet in that form. Sorry. I will say that a certain amount of leakiness is normal in the system. About 5% leakiness is normal. This is the place in the body where the immune system is closest to the surface. And the lumen, if you see that word lumen in the right-hand corner, lumen refers to the opening, like the space basically of the, in this case, the intestine. So it's that empty space is what we would call the lumen. So like the esophagus also has a lumen, which is that empty space of the esophagus. So that word refers to that open space. And in this case, when we're talking about the digestive system, we actually have a lumen that runs all the way from our mouth to our anus. And so in this case, we're thinking about the digestive system is actually outside of us, if that makes sense. Like it comes into our mouth, but it stays in this tube until it leaves on the other end through our anus. And so the body is interacting with what we're bringing into it kind of as if it was reaching outside of our skin. Does that make sense to everybody? Maybe. And the reason that I'm bringing that up is that we have immune cells really close to, there's only like one line of cells here, as you can see in the picture. And then we've got that like layer of mucus, but otherwise we've got the immune cells really close to those cells. And we want there to be a certain amount of leakiness so that the body, the immune system, can be figuring out what generally goes through here. Like what kind of things are generally present in this tube. And the body is pulling out the things that it needs, like, oh, there's those amino acids, I want those, like we're going to pull those in and absorb those. But there's plenty of things that get passed through out as waste. And so we want some amount of leakiness, but generally if folks are experiencing a lot of inflammation or a lot of symptoms of allergies to foods, that's a good indication that the body has been exposed to these larger particles, and now there's going to be an allergic response every time they're in contact again with that allergen. And we talked about this in the respiratory class, that the IgE here that makes the memory B cells here in the middle bottom, middle right, memory B cells and the plasma cells. Like this is kind of our immune system response. This is the same thing that happens with vaccines. Like we're given a little piece of something and the body makes these memory cells and then is circulating and waiting for those to come back again. All right, so we're going to move down into the lower intestines and go through this part pretty quickly so we can talk about herbs. All right, so we've got these different parts of the intestines, and again, this is where we're really seeing most of the absorption happening. Here again, I want you to just see that like this is what the inside of the intestine looks like. It's got those same little dips and valleys there, and the microvilli, and it's got all these little finger-like projections, and that's really so that it can interact with the food, or at this point the chyme that's coming through the system. It's trying to interact as much as it can before it passes through so that it can absorb. And then you also have the hepatic portal vein there, which is going to go right to our liver. All right, so it goes from the stomach, and then pretty much right away after it leaves the stomach, there's going to be an interaction here with the liver and the pancreas. The liver has a million bajillion functions, like over 500 documented roles and jobs. So we certainly can't talk about all of them, but some of the ones that are bigger ones that I think of is that the liver is the producer of bile, and that bile is produced from recycled red blood cells, and that bile is used for breaking down fats. And when those blood cells are not broken down, they continue to circulate and produce jaundice. So that's what, if you've ever seen or heard of jaundice, that's when the red blood cells are not breaking down correctly and the liver is not functioning well. And that's when we see that yellow in the eyes, is from those red blood cells that are not able to break down and be recycled. We also have the ability to remove toxins and byproducts at this stage. And it's also a place where things are broken down, metabolized, and I really think of the liver as like the great recycler. Like it takes things in and it makes them into available forms for the different parts of the body. And it also kind of helps us to separate out the things that will, become stool and the things that will become nutrients. Now, the liver also is a place that stores glucose, right, which is one of our main forms of energy. It also stores things like vitamin A, B12, vitamin D, vitamin E, some vitamin K, and iron and copper. Things that are absorbed through the gut go into the things that are absorbed into the gut, into the bloodstream, must go to the liver next. Like that's the first place it's going to go. So that includes, any kind of like drugs that we're taking, any sort of toxins, alcohols. They all have to go to the liver and to be broken down into water-soluble forms so that the kidneys can excrete them. That's why, like, when we take vitamins, there might be like a change in color of your urine there. There's things that are excreted through the kidneys that the job of the liver is to make it water-soluble so that the kidneys can then deal with it. Yeah, okay. All right, so here's just kind of another picture here of the liver and the stomach, and you'll see kind of tucked up under the liver there, the little green guy is our gallbladder. And the gallbladder's job is to hold on to bile, stored bile, and release it when we need it. And when we don't have a gallbladder anymore, if we have to have a gallbladder removed, then we only have the bile that's produced by the liver at that time. So that's when it's even maybe more important to make sure that our system is primed and ready for digestion, because at that point we only have the liver to do that function for us. And then we have the pancreas, and the pancreas is right there at that same little axis. And the job of the pancreas at this point is to dump those digestive enzymes into the system. So this happens at the beginning of the intestines, right? So our body hopefully is making all the digestive enzymes that it needs. And right after it leaves the stomach, that's where we have the interaction both with the gallbladder and liver, and we have that interaction with the pancreas dumping in all those cells. The pancreas also has other jobs, right? It helps with hormones like insulin, but when it comes to digestion, in this kind of chain of events that we're following, the digestive enzymes is kind of next. And then we have our large, large intestine here, the transverse colon, and we're moving down into the rectum and the anus. And of course, we have to talk about poop a little bit. So I found these online through Healthline, and I just thought that the pictures were really great and very informative as different ways to think about what the shape and consistency and color and all of those things, they tell you so much about the health of your gut. A while back at Foxhaven, we had Dr. Chutkin come and give a talk about the gut microbiome and her book, Gut Bliss. And she has a whole chapter that's called Turn Around and Look. And it's all about what our stool and different waste products can tell us about the health of our body. And herbalism is very much in tune with this as well. There's always lots of questions about what do your waste products look like. Right, so here we have like the differences in diarrhea, which can tell us a lot about how much distress our body might be in. The frequency of how often we have a bowel movement, right? 2 days apart is considered constipation. Healthy is really, I would say, several times a day. Personally, I think that's healthiest, but every other day is still considered healthy. And then the size and what different colors might tell you, right? Like if you've ever had beets before and then been totally freaked out and thought you were bleeding, remembering what you've been eating. Licorice can turn your stool black. But then things to look out for, right, is this like pale white, clay colored, or yellow, right? If there's like floating stool that has like a pale color to it, like that's something that we want to be aware of really quickly, because that might mean that we're having some malabsorption issues, or we're not having enough bile production, and so there might be something happening with our liver. And this was a great little slide from Urban Moonshine about the way that herbs can help the digestive system. And you'll have this in the recording, so you can give it a look further on or later. So how we can help the gut is to avoid things like non-steroidal antibiotics, those kind of things if we don't need them. One thing that I didn't mention about things like Advil is that it's been shown that a dose of Advil can produce little pinprick holes in the lining of the gut. And those little pinprick holes can then lead to these leaky gut syndrome, especially if we're taking those on a regular basis. So trying to find alternatives to non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. Practice less stress-reducing techniques so that we can go into that parasympathetic, the rest and digest. Eat slowly, chew well. Drink enough water. Folks say about half your weight in ounces a day. And as we discussed earlier, maybe think about doing that before and after meals, not during meals. Remove offending foods. We probably all know what foods might trigger us, and it's really difficult to make changes because food is so connected to so much of our life and also connected to so much of our social life and, you know, our families. But as best you can, try to remove them even for a little while to see how that helps you. Eat good whole food. I put the, you know, we know what that means, I think. But I also think that is different for different people. So there's not a diet that's best for everybody, in my opinion. Eat foods that are high in prebiotic and probiotic potential. Use herbs that are demulcent, that means slippery, and soothing to the mucous membranes. That's things like marshmallows, oats, flax, chia, edible jute, okra, asparagus, fermented vegetables, artichoke, and Jerusalem artichoke. And then use herbs that tone the muscles and relax the nerves. And those are mostly going to be our bitters. And when I say relax the nerves, then I'm thinking about bitter nervines. So someone mentioned, blue vervain earlier, and that's a really great one. That's both relaxing to the nerves and also great for toning muscles through that bitter action. And then blue vervain is kind of specific, right, to folks that like hold their tension in their neck and shoulders and like are kind of in their heads when they're stressed. So each of the herbs has their affinities as well and kind of like deeper abilities outside of just being bitter or nervine. All right, we're gonna skip the breakout groups for the moment because we're running a little short on time. But I wanted to just touch on, you know, how all of these different symptoms that we might experience, things like bloating, gurgling, acid reflux. There's lots of reasons that you might experience any of those. But I think just like we did with the respiratory system, for those of you that were with us for the respiratory system, thinking about symptoms as the body trying to give us a message, and also thinking about symptoms as the body trying to point out a habit. And so when we feel discomfort, that's a good place to stop and try to think about what is happening, or what have I been doing lately, or what is the body trying to tell me. So something like constipation might be that you are not drinking enough water, or maybe it's that you waited too long to go to the bathroom, because actually when the body is ready, every time we eat a meal, the body sends messages further down into the colon to move and make room. And if we have to have a bowel movement but we decide not to, right, because that is something that we often have the ability to not do, we have control over that, that stool will go back up into the sigmoid colon, and every time it has to go back up into that part of the colon, it will pull a bit more water out of, the body will pull a bit more water out of the stool. So by the end, you might end up having really dry stool and constipation when maybe it wasn't a problem further up, but the fact that you're not allowing yourself to go to the bathroom when you need to is creating constipation for you. So there's all these different things that can be kind of happening. And like I said, the digestive system is just so complex. So what remedies do folks already know of for digestion? Like what have you tried at home, or what is like a family technique, when you have an upset stomach, or anybody want to share?
We have a question while folks start thinking about that. So do bitters have some positive impact on GERD?
Yes. Yeah. So the positive impact that it can have on GERD potentially is that for some folks, the GERD is because there's not enough tone in that sphincter. And so by potentially adding some bitters, you could strengthen that and prevent that, that sphincter from being open or being faulty. That's one suggestion. Also, sometimes acid reflux and GERD is a result of not enough acid in the stomach. This is not true for everybody, but for a lot of folks that might reach for an antacid, that oftentimes won't fix their problem. What might actually help them is to add a bit more acid production to their body and do that toning. So there is definitely instances when that's actually the case. And Guido Massé is an herbal doctor that will often talk about how when folks come to him with digestive issues, one of the first things he'll prescribe or suggest is dandelion root, which is a very common herb, and he'll prescribe it however they need it, as a tea or a tincture or whatever. But for a lot of people, just having that little bit of bitter, and dandelion's not even strong bitter, but that little bit of bitter will help them to ease that gastric reflux.
And back to our question, what remedies do we know? People are coming in with some answers. We've got apple cider vinegar for stomach digestion. Brendan says mint tea for a tummy ache. Christine says ginger for a tummy ache. Brendan says flaxweed for poop problems.
Yeah, flaxweed, flaxseed.
Gotcha.
Flaxseed. Yeah. Yeah.
Those
Yeah,
ones
for like bulking up the stool and like moistening the the stool. Yeah, absolutely. My second question is, why do you think it's hard to change food habits? Or if you've ever tried to change a food habit, what was hard about it? Folks don't have things to add to that. I can say, in addition to just being like something that's so tied to emotion and nostalgia and family and all those things, like it's also just like a big major routine in our life, right? We do it 3 times a day, so it's something that we have to think about on a regular basis, multiple times a day, for a lot of folks. And so it can be very overwhelming to make a food change, and we have potentially long-standing habits, and those will take time to change. So I would say if you are thinking about anything you've learned from today, and wanting to change food habits, just be gentle on yourself and know that it's very normal for everybody to kind of backslide into habits, especially when it's something that we encounter so many times a day, and in so many social ways. All right, so there's all these herbal actions that are associated with different herbs, and most of these are probably really familiar to a lot of you. I'm going to talk about them a bit more when we're talking about the herbs. So I'm going to kind of move through this because you will have the recording, so you can go back and look at this. And I also have a handout that we can send afterwards that has all this information on it. But just thinking about real quickly, like a couple of you mentioned like mint and ginger. And in this slide here, that falls under antispasmodics as herbal actions. And one of the ways that those work is actually the essential oils that are in the peppermint and the ginger actually gently disturb and kind of aggravate the lining of the stomach and the lining of the intestines. And it creates this ripple effect that smooths out the spasms that might be happening in your stomach. So it seems a little counterintuitive actually, but there's like, these essential oils are in some senses like kind of nudging at the muscles to be like, hey, like relax, chill out. Here's some more herbal actions, things like carminatives. Again, here we're thinking like ginger is a carminative, right? But we have warming carminatives and cooling carminatives. Carminatives are helpful in helping us to dispel gas, and ginger would definitely fall under that warming. Peppermint, classically falls under cooling, but if you ask my opinion, it's a warming herb. But I think that might be different for different people. Spearmint, I definitely think of as cooling, but I put it on here as cooling because in most references, you're going to find it as a cooling herb. I'd say try it for yourself and see if you feel that's the case. Bitter, again, bitter is an action, right? Not just a flavor or a noun. So a bitter action is when the taste of bitter sets off a chain reaction in the body that begins the release of the digestive juices and stimulates appetite. Cholagogues are herbs that help us to release more bile from the liver and the gallbladder, which is really helpful in fat digestion. So if you're someone who doesn't digest fat very well, the way you might tell if you don't digest fat very well is that you might have dry skin, brittle nails and hair. You might have floating stool. You might be more prone to something like eczema. you know, those might be some places to start looking if you have any of those symptoms or conditions in your life, thinking about the production of bile and how fats play a role in your life might be somewhere to look. Demulcents, right? These are herbs that are rich in mucilage. They're slippery, so that flaxseed that was mentioned just a moment ago, these are herbs that help us to build the mucous membrane by coating and nourishing the tissues. So here's like another way to look at that, right? That we have drying and toning herbs. So blackberry leaf, burdock root, coffee, yellow dock, ginger, catnip. Drying and toning. We might think of drying and toning when we're having issues with, for example, diarrhea. In general, right, we're thinking that diarrhea is a message from the body. So we don't want to just suppress diarrhea on a chronic basis. But if we have, maybe we've been traveling and we've picked up a little bug, or we've been, we've eaten something that our body really didn't agree with, and we're having like a lot of diarrhea that is, really affecting our ability to travel to the next place while we're traveling, or, might be affecting our ability to maintain hydration. This might be when you need blackberry leaf or blackberry root, actually, is a really strong drying, toning astringent for the colon in particular. Then we've got things like cooling, right? Yellow dock also fits into cooling. So this would be a cool, dry toning instead of a warming, dry toning. We've got moistening down there and warming. And then here's our nervines, right? Because we talked about how connected the nervous system is with our digestive system. So if we are in a constant place of stress, or even just our body is like not great at learning how to relax yet, that might be a problem for some of us. For some of us, the digestive issues we're having are not related to anxiety or stress, but very often for a lot of folks they are. So here's some herbs that we might pair with different formulas to help us to also address the nervous system. All right, so let's talk about burdock. So this is the burdock root here that you have on the right, and the burdock plant is there on the left. The Latin name is Arctium lapa, and burdock is considered a nourishing plant, especially the root is considered highly nourishing because it's high in starches, and those starches are considered a prebiotic. So this is like the kind of fiber and carbohydrate that the probiotic or like gut microbiome has, a heyday in eating and breaking down, and it can create, gas and distension for people actually that aren't used to having much prebiotic in their diet. So for folks that like don't eat a lot of artichokes, for example, like if they eat a bunch of artichokes, they might experience like a lot of gas after that. And that's really just like the probiotics, the microbiome, like eating those starches and kind of creating a lot of gas off. But in the long run, if you are able to incorporate this into your diet and do it slowly, you won't have such a strong reaction at all. It's slightly bitter. It's definitely on the earthy side. I would consider this an oily plant. And a lot of folks will talk about this as an alterative or a metabolic tonic. Alterative is in that list of actions. Alteratives basically mean that it helps us to improve the ability to absorb and assimilate nutrients and also to eliminate wastes. So it helps us with that breakdown process and the ability of our cells to actually take in what's coming in rather than having these kind of like faulty lines of communication in which we're not capturing the nutrients efficiently. It's helpful in improving the functioning of the liver and the kidneys. It's definitely considered a digestive plant, and it does have some action on the lymphatic and endocrine system as well. Burdock is a plant that we think of in particular for the skin, and all parts of the plant have different uses for the skin, but this is a plant that I think of to use internally, either as food. You can roast this, you can pickle it, or you can make it into a tea or a tincture. I think of it as a plant that helps with the sebaceous glands, those glands on the outside of the skin that produce oil that help to nourish, kind of like the mucus that we produce in our stomach. It's the oil that helps us, protect our skin. this is a plant that's really useful in that way. And there's a connection definitely in multiple forms of herbalism between the condition of the skin and the condition of the digestion. Not everybody will present this way necessarily, but for folks that deal with a lot of skin issues or boils, eruptions, pimples, blackheads, that kind of thing, like they're a good place to start looking is, how well is your liver functioning? Because the liver, like I said, is a place to break down and make things available. And when the liver might not be functioning as well as it could, the skin is also another source of, is another avenue of elimination. And so you might start seeing things coming out more through the skin, and that's obviously usually not what we want. This is also considered a salty and minerally herb, so has a lot of nutritive value. Dandelion, Taraxacum officinale. This is the one that I said, Guido Massé, anytime he has herbs with clients with digestive complaints, he will recommend starting with dandelion. And just that alone will often radically change the condition. Dandelion is usually thought of for the kidneys and the liver, and as kind of a gentle and effective tonic that can be applied to most digestive disorders. It's one that, it's a good place to start. It's not overly bitter, but it does definitely have, slow and steady actions, especially when there's things like gut fermentation that's happening, constipation, indigestion, and even like a lack of appetite. So you might use the root in powder form, in food form, in tincture form. And it's also a great source of things like vitamin A, B, C, and E, and things like calcium and iron. It's also starchy, right? So also, helping to feed those gut microbiome. The actions that we would apply to it is like, it's a cholagogue. So this is the one that helps us to produce more bile for breaking down fats. It's a mild laxative, and it's also a mild diuretic. So it's generally going to help us to, not speed up necessarily, but like more efficiently discard of wastes from the body. There's gentian. Gentian doesn't grow in our area. This is definitely like a high alpine plant, as you can see in the picture. But I put gentian on here because it's one of the most bitter plants that we have kind of in the canon of traditional bitters formulas. So if you've ever used like Angostura bitters, like all these kind of like traditional bitters, or the Amaros from Italy, they almost always have gentian in them. And it's definitely considered like a pure bitter, and it's a cold bitter. And it doesn't have a whole lot of other tastes. It's just kind of like just bitter. But it's really great for the release of those digestive juices. And if you're going to add a bunch of other herbs on top of it, like gentian is usually one that is kind of like the base that's really making sure that you're getting that that bitter taste. So I think of it definitely for liver stagnation as well, and congestion, just like when the liver is not functioning well enough and you're feeling that heaviness in the body, something that's this bitter can really kickstart it. Yellow dock root. So we've got the yellow dock there in the bottom left-hand corner, and that's what it looks like as a plant there on the right. And then those are the seeds. Yellow dock is also considered a bitter plant, and this is one that I often think of when there is maybe some form of bacterial overgrowth, or kind of dysbiosis that's happening, some sort of overgrowth in the gut, because it seems to be pretty good at helping to correct that balance. It's also bitter enough that it's very helpful in stimulating the liver, just like dandelion and gentian are. The seeds here can be eaten when they're fully dry. You can make them into a powder and actually use them to replace flour in like simple cakes. So it's a really useful plant to know, actually. And this one I put in because it's wild, and so you'll often see it around here. There is a cousin, a bitter dock, that is a little bit different. It's definitely more bitter, not quite as delicious as this one, honestly. I find the yellow dock to be really delicious. That yellow color comes from the fact that it has berberine in it. And berberine is the same thing that you might find in golden seal, but golden seal is considered a plant that is at risk now because it's been over-harvested. So yellow dock is, maybe a plant that you could use in different doses from the golden seal, but has some of the same properties and constituents of being able to be antibacterial. And then we've got blackberry leaf and root. Like I said, blackberry is really like a strong astringent. I went to a class with Seven Song, if you're familiar with the herbalist Seven Song from New York. And he referred to it, this is a little crass, I apologize, but I thought it was very apt. He referred to it as a butt cork, that it is so effective at drying up diarrhea that it's almost like you physically corked and like there will be no more diarrhea. And I can attest to this. This is a plant that I take with me when I travel, or if I go camping or something like that, just in case. And yeah, within about 15 minutes of taking the tea, that's enough. You can also do it as a tincture. This plant is also really high in antioxidants. The leaves in particular are really high in antioxidants. And so it's a plant that helps us with cell regeneration and cell health and the immunity of our cells. And so thinking about the gut lining and how those cells are replaced, and also that inflammation, chronic inflammation can really cause, cell mutation over time, right? And that's how we can, unfortunately, lead down a path of long-term disease or even cancers. And so having these, plant polyphenols and antioxidants in our diet are really protective to the herb, to the cells, hopefully. And then fennel seed and leaf. Fennel's my go-to after a big meal if I've eaten too much or maybe something I eat just isn't sitting well. Fennel seed is definitely considered a carminative, so it helps with gas. Oops, excuse me. And then it's also a cooling herb. Just a second, I'm sorry. So it's also a cooling herb. And for me, I guess when I experience digestive issues, sometimes it just feels very fiery to me. And so I wouldn't want to put something like ginger on top of that because I'm already feeling kind of a burning sensation. So I want something to cool it down. So that's where I would reach for something like the flax. But if there's some burning sensation as well as some gas, then fennel seed is kind of my go-to for feeling better. So especially when one is feeling bloated, distended, crampy, you can eat the seeds whole. If you've ever been to, an Indian restaurant that might have like a little candy dish of fennel seeds, that's what that is intended for. And you can also take it preemptively before dinner as a way to soothe spasms if that's something that you encounter a lot in your own eating. And then ginger. So same family as turmeric and cardamom. And it doesn't just really, spice up your dish. It's actually, has a lot of digestive uses. It's really great at kickstarting digestion for folks that feel like their digestion is sluggish, especially if they feel like the food kind of sits in their stomach for a long time, or they feel very heavy after a meal, or they feel cold after a meal. Ginger helps us to bring fresh blood flow and speed up the flow of our blood. And so it can be really helpful for folks that have that kind of sensation after eating. It stimulates the tissues in general, makes us feel warm, makes us feel, alive. And so, yeah, if you are struggling with that, I would think of herbs like ginger, cayenne, sage, cardamom. All these pungent herbs are really helpful in stimulating when there is sluggishness or even, stopped, digestion. So what can we start today? We can start by eating something bitter, whether that's a little bitter salad or a bitter pastille or bitter cocktail. We can play nice with our vagus nerve. Play, laugh, smile, be silly, sing, figure out what makes you fall into that parasympathetic nervous system and try to engage that before you eat, especially if you generally have to eat in a stressful situation. Like, try to develop some sort of technique for yourself to feel at ease. Do hobbies that bring you joy. You can experience vibrations through musical instruments, a cat purring on you, humming. There's plenty of studies out there about how vibrations, literally send, vibrations and shock waves through the body that can help to relax the nervous system. Practice being present. You can meditate, observe nature. This is where prayer comes in for so many folks when it comes to meals. It's a way to be present and focus on what you're doing. You can get body work done or engage in touch with loved ones. Sometimes digestion actually has something to do with your posture or the clothing that you're wearing, and the impingements that happen by the way that we move and walk around, or muscles that are too tight. That's absolutely possible to have issues. Actually, people that like overwork their core to get like that really hard abs, like they can have digestive issues because their core muscles are so tight that they're not able to have good movement through there. And then share meals with folks that make you feel alive. I know that's difficult to do right now in COVID times, but I hope maybe you're even doing like Zoom meals. And then consider a journal. I've kept food journals on and off throughout my life whenever I've experienced issues, and also written journals of just my life. And sometimes it's interesting to see how those will correlate based on what's going on in my life and then what I'm experiencing digestively. Again, chew your food, use those aromatic herbs. There's a really strong history of aromatic herbs being used to help us come into the present. They've been used for rituals, important ceremonies, and everyday beauty. And so maybe incorporating some sort of smell into your dining experience might be what you need to help you relax before you eat. And then drink enough water. All of our body's processes depend on it. Like every single one of them depends on us having enough water. And then I wanted to leave you with this last thing, which is the bitters blending triangle that Caitlin of Hey Thanks Herbal Co. in Baltimore created. She has an amazing line of herbal products, and she ships, and she does these really beautiful bitters. But this is how she goes about thinking about making a bitters, is kind of thinking about the goal of the bitter, thinking about the herbal actions that she needs, and then kind of starting to think about which herbs might work in there. And there at the bottom, she has this sample bitters formula where she takes 30 milliliters, which is that 1 ounce bottle, and she breaks it down into her foundational herbs. So right here she has burdock, dandelion root, yellow dock, and gentian, and she lists there kind of like what those herbs do. And then she has her support herbs or aromatic herbs. So she's got fennel and ginger here as her support herbs. And then she adds just a little bit of sweetness. And I get a lot of questions actually about whether or not you can sweeten your bitters. There's definitely some lots of different theories out there about sweetness. And one is that sweetness can be a catalyst. And that's kind of what she's saying up here at the top, is that a touch of something sweet can balance the taste for you. But we also know that something like licorice, the plant licorice, is considered a catalyst plant that makes other plants work better. And so there's also, just the theory or the thought about how our bodies, remember in the beginning of this talk, how bodies and taste receptors respond to sweet as nourishment. So if we have just a little bit of sweet in there with that bitter, we don't know all the different chain reactions that happen in the body, but there are some thoughts, and certainly, there's whole theories around medicine, like Unani Tibb has a whole theory around how sweet helps the body to be ready for and incorporate nutrients. So yeah, I think that if you want to sweeten your bitters, I think that's totally up to you. But the important part is that you can taste the bitter. You actually have to taste it. I'll take that back, actually. You don't actually have to taste it, because we know that there are bitter taste receptors further down in the lining of the gut and in the stomach. So there are some folks that decide to take their bitters in the form of a capsule that releases, in the hydrochloric acid. And I'm sure that still has plenty of benefits. But from a very kind of traditional standpoint, I like to taste the bitter, because I also find that it has opened my palate so much, and that I'm actually kind of picky about the bitters that I really like now. So I encourage you to taste them if you're able to. All right. Thanks for hanging in there, guys. I know we went a bit over. I tend to be overzealous with my presentations. My apologies.
We do have a few questions, and we can stick around if anyone has any additional ones. Just go ahead and post them in the chat.
Great.
And I'll run through some of the ones I saw. So we have Christina's asking, when is the best time to have a bitter tea? First thing in the morning, on an empty stomach, or with food?
Yeah, great question. A lot of folks will, suggest to have something bitter about 15 minutes beforehand, but there's also a lot of cultures that will have like a bitter salad as the start of their meal. So I think that there's plenty of different ways that you can incorporate that. So yeah, maybe sipping on something bitter while you're cooking. You can definitely have a bitter tea, before a meal. I often will have a bitter tea before bedtime, especially if I feel like I ate too much. Because one of the things that the bitter sensation will do is that, it'll increase those gastric juices. And so like, if I feel like I'm not digesting or if I ate too much, I'm hoping to like increase those gastric juices, to keep digestion going for a bit longer, right? It keeps things in the stomach for a little longer.
And what herbs can help with gastroparesis? Slow digestion, and also help stimulate peristalsis.
Yeah, so these are where I would think about the aromatic herbs. So those are our herbs like cardamom and fennel and ginger and peppermint. Like those are the herbs that I said, like they actually kind of slightly agitate the nerves of the lining of the stomach, and they'll help to make those contractions smoother. And if you're having slow digestion, that's again where I would think about any of the herbs that are bitter that are helping to stimulate digestion, but then maybe working towards getting warmer herbs. A lot of our bitter herbs are considered cold, and that will kind of slow down or decrease function. But you might want to think about warming herbs, so more towards the like turmeric, ginger, cardamom.
Do any of the teas contain caffeine?
None of the teas that I talked about have caffeine, no. Caffeine is a way to speed things up. If that's of interest, you could do a black tea to speed things up.
Brendan says, my body can't handle cheese. Are there any herbs that can help me enjoy cheese again?
I feel for you. Well, a lot of us are lactose intolerant. Like a lot of the world is lactose intolerant, unfortunately. There aren't necessarily herbs that will make it easier to digest cheese, unfortunately, no. There are herbs, it depends on how your body reacts to cheese. Like maybe you're someone who gets diarrhea with having cheese, in which case like you'll want to think about maybe some of those herbs like blackberry leaf as a way to kind of slow that down a little bit so that you're not having such a strong reaction. Or you might think about carminatives if you're experiencing a lot of gas and bloating and distension. So that's where you might want those fennel seeds that you can chew on to help kind of move the gas along. But generally, if your body doesn't like dairy, then there's not a whole lot we can do for you. I'm sorry. Try goat cheese, try ghee, like take those milk solids out and see if that is helpful.
Yeah, that's a good point. It looks like in the chat we've got some folks adding cheese aged over 6 months don't have lactose. So
Right.
The process of aging causes lactose to sweat out and break down. Christine confirms that she's lactose intolerant, but found that aged whole fat cheeses can be digested.
Yeah, so it depends on like where that, like when you say your body doesn't like cheese, it depends where that's coming from. Like, is it the actual proteins that are a problem, or is it the lactose specifically? For a lot of people, it's both. Actually, it's like their body doesn't like the lactose, but also like the actual milk proteins are aggravating to the system.
That's all the questions I'm seeing.
All right.
Thank you all so much for coming. It was such a great presentation, Lacey.
Oh, thanks. My pleasure.
So much great information there. So we'll be sending out the recording and the PowerPoint probably by tomorrow afternoon. So look out for that. And I hope you enjoy.
Great. Thanks for coming, folks from all over the world. It was really nice to see you.
Yeah, London, represent. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lacey.
My pleasure. Yeah. All right. Have a good night, everyone.
Take care.
Bye.
Take care.